Right, I think we're in. So, hello everyone. We are coming in for the next video for the month of May, and today I decided we're going to hit another. Not even, I wouldn't so much call it. I mean, it is a topic, but we're going to say it's another look at the founding of modern American government in some form. In the past, I have covered the Constitutional Convention and how the Constitution came about, and most people are, I would like to think, aware that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, that it is the government of the United States, has been since 1787, which is actually quite a long time for a document to still be in use. And part of the reason is because the Constitution can be amended and still be made applicable to a modern society. But I want to take today and look at a document that precedes the Constitution, or a set of documents, that technically counts as the United States' first official form of government. That was not the Constitution. It is something that is mentioned in school quite a bit, but many people often, I think, forget it as they age, because it just isn't relevant really anymore, unless you're looking at it in the historical context. And that would be the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, to those of you who may very well know your American history, especially around the time of the American Revolution, they are the first official government that is set up for the newly independent United States. And it is our first official government that we officially would operate under until 1787, when the Constitutional Convention would be called in Philadelphia to. Originally, the purpose was to amend the Articles of Confederation, but they ended up finding out there was just so many problems that needed to be addressed that it would be altogether better if we threw the Articles out entirely and drafted something completely new. So what we're going to look at today is more of just a look at this document, at these set of documents technically, and what exactly this first government that the United States lived under, how did it come about, what did it look like, and why ultimately was this replaced? Why did this government fail? So the Articles of Confederation come about as a result of the American Revolution, and that's where we will kind of begin here. For anyone that really needs a reminder of how the revolution came about, you have 13 British North American colonies. Gradually, after 1763, after the end of the French and Indian War, become more and more distressed and angered by their mother country, Great Britain, mostly over the issue of taxation, which Britain had decided to tax the colonies quite a bit after the war, mostly under the judgment that they had a large war debt from the 7 Years' War, and they needed to pay that debt off. When Britain was determining who should pay off that debt, they kind of argued, well, the colonies have kind of benefited possibly the most out of anybody within the empire, because we just expanded our holdings in North America. The French are pretty much gone completely, so there's no longer the French threat in Canada and in the Ohio Valley, and Spain was also hindered during that war. So the colonies have really benefited possibly the most from this. So it's only fair in Parliament's mind that the colonists should have some responsibility and help to repay that war debt. They didn't ask that you pay it all, but they were asking that the colonies pay quite a bit more than what was probably warranted. Especially since, although this war had been won and this land had been gained, colonists were still largely kind of prevented from settling in these western areas, mostly by the proclamation line of 1763, because the empire didn't want to really mess with the whole idea of Native Americans that were already starting to rebel, fearing further European encroachment on their lands. So they set up this proclamation line in the Appalachian Mountains that says, no white European settlement beyond this, by order of the king. It was an official proclamation by King George III. This had angered the colonists quite a bit. And the colonists were angered over the taxation issue, of course, because they had no official representation in Parliament to voice their concerns, and thus they argued the famous argument of no taxation without representation. Eventually, those tensions would build up over a period of roughly 12 years until April of 1775. The battles of Lexington and Concord sparked the breakout of the American Revolution that would rage until 1783, officially. During that time, during the American Revolution, the acting governing body for the colonies and for the war effort as a whole was the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress to be exact, because we had the first a year before the war actually began in 1774. Excuse me. So During the American Revolution, the Second Continental Congress is the governing body for the colonies in their war effort, and this is kind of the big unifying body. The colonies at this point are not officially a new nation. At first, we have to remind ourselves that when the American Revolution starts, the colonies still have this mindset that they don't have a grievance with the king, they have a grievance with Parliament. And the Continental Congress even expressed this in their olive branch petition to King George that they sent to him, basically stating, our quarrel is not with you, your majesty. We still think of ourselves as British subjects. Our quarrel is with Parliament, who is passing these unfair laws upon us. Rapidly, that kind of changed their minds when George rapidly turned 180, regardless of this olive branch peace petition that they had sent to the king, stating that anyone that was caught in being rebellion was basically an act of treason and it would be punishable by death. That they had forgotten the allegiance to the country that had so far nurtured them and provided for them. And that rapidly changed quite a few minds in the Continental Congress after that point, from saying, well, yeah, we're still British citizens, to like, do I want to be part of a nation anymore if the king is even in on this? If the king is even against us and won't listen to us? And during the American Revolution, as the Continental Congress is debating this grand question of independence, there is a general need that starts to be felt that the colonies need to be much closer, more closely united and have a government that is somewhat unified in order to fight Great Britain officially. Because mind you, that though there are 13 North American colonies and they think of themselves as neighbors, they kind of each mostly act independently. They kind of act as almost like their own little mini countries. They have general cordial relations with each other, and at the time of the breakout of the revolution, they're joining together for the purpose of common defense. They don't really think of themselves as one country. They think of themselves as either, if you're from New York, you think of yourself as a New Yorker. You think of yourself as a Georgian from Georgia, or a Virginian from Virginia, or someone from Massachusetts, if you were from Boston or something like that. You didn't think of yourselves as an American. You thought of yourself as whatever colony or soon to be state that you lived in. In 1776, after officially declaring independence from Great Britain, the Second Continental Congress, which was now basically the de facto head of state government for the newborn United States, needed a new form of republican government to support its democratic leanings. The whole purpose of this revolution, as stated supposedly in the Declaration of Independence and in other patriotic pamphlets such as Common Sense by Thomas Paine, had kind of issued this belief that democracy was what was under attack in the colonies, that British constitutional monarchy was failing. It had failed the colonies. We're striking out on our own, and we're going to establish this new democratic republican Roman Republic type kind of government that will allow the people to have their fair say in things. And this, after the Declaration of Independence in 1776, this rapidly becomes the focus of the Second Continental Congress, is officially drafting some kind of a founding document to establish this new government that was badly needed. Many of the states, however, during this time feared a strong central authority. They weren't all that very keen on establishing a really powerful government because, mind you, that is part of the reason why in their argument they are fighting against Great Britain, is that the government, the king and parliament, have become too powerful. They've become too more is a tyrannic rule, and they fear a strong central authoritative government that can basically take control of them and tell them what to do, whatever they want. And because of this hesitation at that, because of this bad experience of Great Britain, many of the states aren't really jumping at the bit to make a government that's really going to have a full-on normal governmental powers. They want it to be very limited, but accomplish the Republican and Democratic goal that they're setting. Many actually thought that a Republican type of government would actually not be able to serve a country as large as what the United States was at that time, what was proclaimed to be the United States of America. And mind you, back then it was only 13 states. Can you imagine that argument now when they'd be looking at the country the size it is now and say, how on earth? There ain't no way that would ever work. And some place you can argue that's also true today, that it has its flaws, because sometimes there's just so many political hicks and hacks to the political system that in some ways people do get disenfranchised. in certain areas in ways that they can't even imagine. I'm not suggesting anything along the lines of, like, elections are rigged or anything like that, but along the lines that not everyone's voice seems to get heard the way it should be because of certain political matters that we have. But during this time, this was the argument. There's question, can a Republican government actually serve a country as large as this is going to be? Because, mind you, at this time in the world, there's not really any democratic Republican governments. Most of the countries of the world at this time are ruled by monarchs. Some by absolute monarchs who think they are ordained by God and hold almost all power, and others who are more like Britain, who are constitutional and are bound and work together with a public legislature and some sort of executive from that legislature, such as the Prime Minister. Politicians and leaders, the fear was among the Second Continental Congress delegates that a Republican form of government would fail because they feared that politicians and leaders would grow out of touch with the people and that would devolve into tyranny at some point. One could also make that argument somewhat to today, and there is some credibility to that argument, but that's a whole nother matter for a whole that you can kind of go on your own time and look at. But that was a legitimate fear. Now, most of the United States, basically most saw it within the colonies, at least. Most only saw the United States not officially as a big, wholly unified nation. They saw it as a loose league or confederation of 13 independent little countries that were bonded together through mutual defense and cooperation and trade. They didn't think of themselves as a unified nation. The proponents of this new type of government argued that a central authority would actually benefit the war effort by allowing a more concentrated effort against the British military and by helping to gain foreign aid and recognition and foster a national feeling that would gradually unify all the 13 states into one. And at the same time, they're hoping that if we kind of present ourselves as a united one single entity country, it's going to be easier to get foreign aid who might be willing to lend money or alliances with us, knowing that they're dealing with one country and not 13 little tiny ones. So that brings us to how the Articles were written. 6 drafts of what would become known as the Articles of Confederation were eventually made before Congress selected a final version in 1777, a year after the Declaration of Independence. The earliest version had actually been drafted before the Declaration, and it was actually written by Benjamin Franklin. I think we all know who Ben Franklin is. And he had wrote this in July of 1775, but it was never even considered at the time. Connecticut delegate Silas Deane offered a draft, which was another draft separate from Ben Franklin's as well, but this one was followed by a revision from the Connecticut delegation, but none of these two were either considered for any kind of consideration among the delegates of the Second Continental Congress. It was actually, surprisingly, the source of who come up with a majority of the articles is kind of shocking, and that was Delegate John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. He introduced a 4th draft in June of 1776, so right on the eve of the point that Congress is already openly discussing the possibility of declaring open independence against Great Britain. And it was Dickinson's 4th draft that would become the version that, after being revised by a committee of the Second Continental Congress, it would be discussed in July and August for the first time. It was Dickinson's draft that would eventually kind of coalesce into the majority of what the Articles of Confederation would become. And the reason it's kind of odd for Dickinson to have been the author of this is because if anyone knows from the debates among the Second Continental Congress over whether or not to declare formal independence from Great Britain, John Dickinson was perhaps the most vocal opponent of proclaiming independence. He was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, and although he was very much a patriot and was mad at British taxation without representation, among many other things that colonists had a problem with, Dickinson was not really jumping at the idea to proclaim full-on independence and still thought of himself very much as a loyal British or Englishman as he thought. So it's kind of odd that he ends up being the one that more or less drafts what will become the first government of this new country that he, at first at least, wasn't all that supportive of. In fact, when the vote came to approve the formal Declaration of Independence and to adopt it, Dickinson, we don't know if he skipped the vote or if he simply abstained, but he did not vote during the Declaration of Independence. So he did not sign it. So it's just kind of odd that it came from him. After several revisions of Dickinson's draft, Copies were then printed to enable Congress to further consider them, and they were finally approved for submission to the states in November of 1777. And that is what becomes the Articles of Confederation. However, in order for them to take effect, they have to be ratified by not just a majority of all the states, they have to be ratified by all 13 in order for them to take effect. So by 1779, all of the 13 states that exist at this time, of the 13 original states, so let's see here, we have Rhode Island, we have New Hampshire, we have Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. You have all these 13 states. Out of those 13, 12 out of the original 13 had ratified by 1779. The exception to that was the state of Maryland. Maryland had an issue with the articles that no other state really seemed to have brought forward as a major issue, but Maryland was having a tizzy with it. Maryland was not really jumping to ratify the articles because they pointed to the fact that it looked as though it would do nothing to solve the conflicting land claims that were being issued by the original 13 states to lands out in the West that they were hoping to get once the war had formally ended. And part of this was because the colonial charters of several states, such as Virginia, Georgia, the Carolinas, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, they all claimed lands for themselves to extend to what they called the South Sea at the time, or the Mississippi River out in the West, even though some of these states, like Connecticut and Massachusetts, didn't even border any land near there, but they claimed it. These charters were in direct contradiction to the actual charters of states like Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Rhode Island, which would confine them to within a few hundred miles of the Atlantic coast. So basically, what the argument from Maryland is coming from is this article does nothing to resolve this issue, and we are bordered by Pennsylvania to the north and Virginia to the south. Very big, very populous, very large, and politically possibly powerful states that could definitely overrule us in this new Articles of Confederation government if we so choose to be a part of it. And thus, Maryland might get shortcut in terms of the gains and the spoils of war, particularly land expansion. Land speculators in Maryland and other states had actually insisted that they wanted something in the articles to say that all of those western lands would not belong to any individual state, but to the United States, to the government as a whole. They urged the Second Continental Congress to honor their claims to western lands. Maryland, knowing that Virginia would be a threat, was basically, this was their main push point, was unless you're going to guarantee that these lands are going to be declared federal land and not individual states' lands, we will not ratify this document. The matter was eventually resolved when current Virginia governor at the time, Thomas Jefferson, who I think we all know, he actually persuaded his state to yield its claims in the West, and as an added bonus, he also asked that all the speculators' demands would have to be rejected. He would reject all speculator demands, and he put a requirement on Virginia's part that in order for Virginia to continue and to not withdraw its ratification of the document, that any new states that would be created in the West would be admitted on the basis of equality with the old 13. So Jefferson's idea was, well, I will get Virginia to back off its land claims if we take this new territory, instead of expanding it into current states, why don't we make it into new ones, and they'll be just as politically powerful as we are, because we will base it on equality with the current 13. Just because, you know, for example, today a new state would still get 2 senators just like every other state in the Senate, even though they're a new state. That was kind of the idea with Jefferson, was they, on a political basis, even though they'd be the younger states, even though they'd be brand new, they will be just as politically powerful as any other. This ended up convincing Maryland that Virginia was backing off, and it convinced Maryland that it was sufficiently protected in this new Articles of Confederation, and Maryland officially ratified it on March 1st of 1781. So it took about 2 years for this debate to really be resolved after it really came to a height in 1789. Well, not 89, but 79. So that brings us to the weaknesses that these articles contain. Why and what do they look like in general? So the Articles of Confederation would actually hold several major weaknesses that are going to prove troublesome in the long run. Maybe not immediately, but as time goes on, they are going to prove to be a major problem. One was that it made a very loose government of almost like a confederation of 13 states. It was not a strong central authoritative government. It was kind of a loose, almost like a, trying to think of something that would kind of describe it. It no, that's not what I would use. It was almost like today you could all like a super glue. The Constitution is a super glue. It's a strong, firm bond between the states. Where back then you're talking to something that's probably no better than maybe some melted gum that you can easily pull apart. It's gum trying to hold these states together. The government that is created was not strong enough to enforce the laws that it was put in charge of enforcing, and it couldn't raise taxes in order to fund itself. It made it difficult also for the nation to repay its debts from the Revolutionary War, which would become and persist to be a major issue until at least the 1790s into George Washington's presidency. Part of the problems that this new government has is, shockingly, there is no executive and there's no judiciary. Only Congress. Like today, we have three branches of government. Well, back then, we just have one. Congress is the only branch of government. Ratification had also not solved the debate over the appointment of taxes, which kind of forecasted another issue that's going to come up when the Constitutional Convention convenes in 1787, and that is the issue of slavery. Why? Because we have another instance, as I mentioned in that video when I did the Constitutional Convention. Some of us are familiar with the Three-Fifths Compromise. That when it came to the issue of, they determined that the House of Representatives, that each state would have a total number of members in there based upon their population. Well, keep this in mind. I discussed this when I did that video, but I'm pointing this as an example. The southern states have large enslaved populations. They do not consider those enslaved persons to be people. They consider them to be property. But yet, when this moment came to enlarge their own political power in this newly founded federal government by having these enslaved people counted as people for the purpose of census and population, so they could gain delegates in the House of Representatives, they were all for counting them as people then, just not as an actual human being when push came to shove. And the same issue kind of comes up when determining the taxes, the appointment of state taxes to be paid to Congress as part of the Articles. Dickinson's draft, in order to provide some sort of funding for Congress, had actually required the states to provide money to it every year in proportion to their population. So the larger the population you had, the more money that was expected of that state to pay toward the Congress in order to fund it. This would include, according to Dickinson's original draft, both whites and blacks, both free white men and enslaved people. However, unfortunately for them, that was not at all what ended up occurring, because the southern states start putting up a hissy fit where just a few years later, like, oh yeah, no, they're not proper. We count them as people. And the northern states rightfully said, well, you don't count them as people any other time. Why do you want them counted now? Oh, because you have some political advantage to gain here. Well, this is what exactly happens when Dickinson's draft is. The southern states see that because if this includes the count on blacks, since they have large enslaved populations at the time, they are going to have a much higher tax that they're going to have to pay to fund Congress every year, and they're not for that because that money's being taken away from them. So now they're approaching saying, well, they shouldn't be counted as people. We don't consider them people here, but we'll consider them people if you're going to give us more representatives. Do you see the hypocrisy in this argument? The hypocrisy that white Southerners at the time would just argue anything to defend slavery, but at the same time give themselves, the advantage in the political field. And this was a couple years before the other. And of course, the southern states, because of this, they say, no, we're not agreeing to that unless this changes. So eventually what ended up happening was Congress ignored this complaint initially, but eventually they resolved it by caving in and changing that the taxes would instead be determined by the value of state lands and improvements, not upon their populations, which the Southern states were okay with. The slavery debate would later occur again during the Constitutional Convention, and many times after that, up until, of course, the Civil War. It had to happen in order to purge this country of that moral sin. The third article of the Articles of Confederation actually described the Confederation established in them as, quote, a firm league of friendship of the 13 states and for, quote, common defense, the security of their liberties, and mutual general welfare. It would establish a unicameral Congress, just one house, not a two-house Congress, as the head of the government. Each state would hold one vote in Congress, and delegates would be elected by their state legislatures, not by the people. And each state would maintain, quote, its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. They would be treated almost as little individual countries. That would still be maintained. The new Congress would still have several key weaknesses, however, of the Continental Congress during the American Revolution. Number one, it could not levy taxes. Although the Articles of Confederation did provide that the states had to pay a tax in order to fund Congress, Congress had no power to raise that tax in the future should the need arise. It was set to whatever it was in there. And they couldn't regulate commerce between the states. They had no way to do that, and that was partly out of the fear of a strong central authority over regulating things. Congress could exercise some powers, however, under the Articles. They weren't devoid of everything. For one, the new Congress would have jurisdiction in managing foreign relations with other countries, and it could make treaties and alliances with other nations. It could also levy war and peace. It could declare war and, of course, issue peace and treaties and everything else. It could maintain a military. It could coin money for this new country, and it could establish a postal service. That was all provided for in the Articles of Confederation. It would also be in charge of handling Native American affairs with Native American tribes and establish admiralty courts that would deal with appealed cases from the states that have been basically appealed from the top state courts. Well, this is basically the equivalent of now we have the Supreme Court, which is the top court in the land. So back then in the Articles of Confederation, it is these admiralty courts that are the top courts. They are the ones that are going to be the final answer on any state cases that get appealed to the higher courts to formally decide. So instead of a Supreme Court, we have admiralty courts that are set up by Congress. Congress would hold these powers, but it did see limitations on actions like war making and making the coins, and of course the treaties would all require the assent of states, and all others would have to have a majority. So on some of these issues, like declaring war or issuing money or getting treaties made, it would require the assent of 9 out of the 13 states. That's almost an impossible number to get. And all the others, it would have to be like 7. 7 out of the states would have to do it, would have to assent to it. The states would remain sovereign and independent. However, they also had some restrictions put on them. They could not impose restrictions on trade or citizen movement between them. So basically, states have open borders between them. There's no restriction on free trade. There's no restriction on the movement of people from one state to another. Open state lines. No problem with that. They also had to honor the judicial decisions that were made by the courts in other states. So if a court in New York had argued that this person was guilty of robbery, even though the person lived in Maryland, Maryland might be responsible for handing down the punishment that was decided by that court in New York. But they had to honor that court's decision on verdict on that defendant. To amend the Articles, however, all 13 states would have to agree to even try to amend them at any point in the future. To anything that would be amended, it had to be all 13. It had to be a unanimous decision to amend the Articles, and that itself would be a big problem in the future of getting them fixed, if they need be. I actually have a copy of the Articles of Confederation in this book here. This is actually when I found it Cracker Barrel a year ago, and I bought it because it actually has a lot of the founding documents in it, including it has like all the Federalist Papers. I've never seen all the Federalist Papers before in a printed text. It was like $20. If we go in here, right here we have the start of the Articles of Confederation. I don't know how well this is going to appear. I hope it does. Yeah, and they go for quite a bit. I mean, they are numbered. They are numbered articles. Like right here, we have Article 6 down here in the bottom. And I'll read like the first one. The very first one is very short. It just says, "The style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America," while Article 2 states that each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. And entirely, it looks like there were a total, this is the last article, there were a total of 13 articles, ironically. There were 13 articles in the Articles of Confederation. But this is the original article, so they're kind of cool to look at when you look at them, because you can see how the government first looked when it was founded, but you can also notice some very big discretions that are going to come about from that. I'm going to take a drink here. Ugh. But of course, there's going to be some problems that really come out of this, and this was something I found peculiar. I did mention a little bit ago here that Congress, as part of the Articles of Confederation, not Congress, but the states have open trade and open borders with each other. Congress could not regulate that commerce, however, and that was itself a problem. The states couldn't put restrictions on trade from another state. They couldn't penalize other states at all. However, since Congress couldn't regulate commerce, according to the Articles of Confederation, there was the problem that states could put like large taxes or tariffs on imports from other states, and there was nothing in the articles that would prevent them from doing that. And that is actually supported because this is a this is like a history of the United States book. This is an antique one. This is like a I want to say 1915 reprint of one that had come out in like 1900. This is like a second edition that came out in 1915. And right in here on page 147, it has that, for instance, right here, Congress, for instance, could not tax the people for money with which to pay the country's debts. It could merely ask the states for what it needed, but the states did not give all that was needed. Congress, in the next place, could not regulate trade with foreign nations. It could not force them to treat us fairly. Neither Spain nor Great Britain would make a treaty of commerce with us. And what also I kind of relate to the factor that since Congress couldn't regulate commerce, and since the states they couldn't penalize each other, but they could still put taxes and tariffs on there, that created its own problems, as stated right in here. Congress had no power to regulate trade between the states. As a consequence, each state regulated its trade as it pleased. New York, for instance, treated Connecticut and New Jersey as foreign countries and laid heavy taxes on firewood that came from the one and on vegetables that came from the other. This angered New Jersey, who sent word to Congress that unless it forced New York to take off the taxes, she would not pay her annual share of the cost of the Continental government. So New Jersey, according to this, in this 1915 history book, I'm reading from this right here. According to this 1915 history book, New York passed and had taxes on goods coming in from Connecticut and New Jersey. New Jersey, I'm going to guess Connecticut probably did as well, but in this case, it specifically mentions New Jersey got irritated to the point that it came in front of the Congress and it said, look, New York is taxing my business people to ship their products into that state at obnoxiously high rates that they can barely make a profit. So New Jersey argues to Congress, like, either get New York to back off on these taxes, get rid of them, or I'm going to withhold my taxes, my tax money that I'm obligated to pay to fund you for the next coming year. Well, the problem was, although New Jersey had this dispute with New York, Congress really didn't have the power to actually do anything about it. They could ask Congress, but remember, Congress can't levy taxes. It can't really order the states around. The states kind of order it around, but it can't really order them, and that's a problem. there were some successes that did come out during the 1780s under the decade of governance under the Articles of Confederation. One of them was that Western expansion did indeed proceed, mostly through the 1787 Northwest Ordinance that would set up the Northwest Territory, which Ohio would eventually be made out of, and the population of the country did generally grow. However, you had other problems, such as, aside from what we have mentioned, you have problems with Britain, which is contributing to a growing nationalism in the country because of these continued quarrelings and antagonizings with Britain, and a sense of a more enabled government being needed. Particularly, the new government, since the United States couldn't really regulate commerce and Congress didn't have the authority, Britain, as was mentioned in this, would not sign a commerce treaty with us. And thus, some places within the British Empire, we were actually banned from trading. Americans were banned from even going and selling their goods. One of these examples was in the British West Indies in the Caribbean. And another possibly more pressing issue is the United States is, according to the Treaty of Paris of 1783, is supposed to be a fully sovereign nation that has full control over the territory within its borders, and Britain was supposed to evacuate all its troops out, all its forts, and supposed to leave. Well, here it is almost 10 years after the end of the Revolution, and there are still British forts in the Northwest Territory because Britain knows that the new Congress isn't really that powerful and can't really do anything to force them out quite yet. So they're like, well, we'll leave when you get powerful enough to kind of force us out. But right now, we're going to stay around. There were attempts made to amend the Articles. However, they were made mostly on the ability of Congress to grant it a taxation power, and of course that wasn't real popular in a country that had just fought an 8-year-long Revolutionary War, partly because they didn't like being taxed. And so attempts to amend them as early as 1781 and a final one in 1786 both failed. And finally, after Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in about around 1786, it kind of forced them to finally decide that, yeah, we need to amend this entirely. And it was with that issue that the states kind of realized, with the state of the economy at that point and how things were getting to the rebellion point in Massachusetts, they kind of realized, okay, we need to seriously consider amending the Articles here. And that would eventually lead into the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where the Articles would be discarded altogether. So that is basically the gist of the Articles here. The Articles, you can look them up on your own time, of course. You can look at almost any founding document, any textbook, or go online, you can read them. And they're quite interesting to look at because they are the first sort of government for the United States. Problem is, it's too weak of a government to hold the country together effectively and to govern effectively. And this is what leads to the Constitution, which we're still using today. So it's kind of cool to see, what was included from off the bat, but what eventually was also gotten rid of, and what they decided needed to be changed, which you can look at when you go through the Constitution and compare them. Excuse me. So that concludes our video for today. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, be sure to leave them in the comment section below, and I will be sure to go through them. If anyone has any suggestions, same there. As for next week, I don't know what video yet, but we'll come to it in time. But we will have another video next week for certain. That's going to happen. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and hopefully everyone found this quite interesting. I know I found it quite interesting to see some of the things that were changed here, but it was actually very much interesting to take an in-depth look at them. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, or a good weekend at this point, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video.